The first time Marcus saw the millionaire's eyes in that grand lobby, they were filled with a shame so heavy it folded around him like a chain. It wasn't pride, not at all. It was something quieter, something that begged to be unseen. The silence hung thick, the kind that swallowed whole rooms without a sound. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're sweeping a hallway, checking cameras, or locking the building doors for the night. It doesn't matter what time it is. But I promise you, today's story will shake you to your core. This is the story of Daniel Rodriguez, a man who carried more dignity in his worn-out jacket pocket than all the glittering suits in that towering Manhattan building combined. For 15 years, Daniel had kept the polished marble floors of 845 Park Avenue spotless and the secrets even cleaner. His weathered hands knew every corner of that 30-story monument to wealth, every hidden crack behind the gold-leafed elevators, every whispered conversation that echoed through the halls after midnight. The building itself was a fortress of glass and steel that pierced the New York sky like a gleaming needle, its windows reflecting the Hudson River in the distance. Inside, the lobby stretched out like a cathedral of capitalism, with Italian marble that cost more per square foot than most people earned in a month. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen tears, casting fractured light across faces that rarely smiled unless money was changing hands. Daniel's world was one of shadows and silence. Every morning at 5:30, before the city's heartbeat quickened to its relentless rhythm, he would arrive through the service entrance on East 79th Street. His keys, a heavy ring of brass and steel that had grown warm from 15 years of faithful service, would jangle softly as he unlocked door after door, bringing life to a place that slept fitfully among its mountains of cash and cryptocurrency wallets. He moved through those halls like a ghost with purpose, his footsteps muffled by years of practice. The residents, hedge fund managers, tech moguls, oil heiresses, and pharmaceutical executives barely registered his presence. To them, Daniel was furniture that happened to breathe, a fixture as permanent and unremarkable as the security cameras that blinked red in every corner. But Daniel saw everything. He watched the pharmaceutical heiress on the 20th floor cry into her phone about insider trading investigations. He observed the tech mogul's son stumble through the lobby at 3 a.m, reeking of cocaine and privilege. He listened as the hedge fund manager's wife planned to hide assets in offshore accounts, her voice echoing off the marble walls like a confession she never meant to make. Daniel's apartment was a studio in Washington Heights, a 40-minute subway ride that took him from the land of the ultra-wealthy to a neighborhood where children played in fire hydrant water and grandmothers sat on stoops sharing stories in Spanish. His walls were bare, except for a single photograph of his late wife, Maria, taken at Coney Island 30 years ago when they were young and believed love could conquer anything. Next to her picture sat a small wooden cross his mother had carved by hand in Puerto Rico, a reminder that dignity didn't require a stock portfolio. The smell of his building was different, not the sterile fragrance of wealth, but the honest aroma of life being lived. Sofrito simmering in Mrs. Morales' apartment, the lingering scent of industrial soap from the laundromat downstairs, the sweet perfume of the bodega's fresh bread each morning. This was Daniel's real world, where people knew his name and asked about his health, where respect was earned through character, not net worth. Every weekday, Daniel would wake in darkness, shower in silence, and dress in his uniform, a navy blue shirt and matching pants that had been washed so many times they felt like silk against his skin. He would pack his lunch, usually a sandwich Maria had taught him to make years ago, and begin his journey into Manhattan's glittering belly. The subway ride was his meditation time. He would sit among other early risers, hospital workers heading to their shifts, janitors like himself, security guards who protected the dreams of people who would never learn their names. These were his people, the invisible army that kept the city functioning while the wealthy slept in beds that cost more than annual salaries. Daniel had developed an almost supernatural ability to read people's secrets. 15 years of invisibility had transformed him into a human surveillance system, cataloging details that others missed. He knew which residents were having affairs by observing elevator button patterns and noting unusual visitor schedules. He could predict bankruptcies by watching how men's shoulders slumped when they checked their phones, how women's voices cracked when they spoke to their personal assistants about restructuring their investments. His memory was a steel trap, storing information with the precision of a computer database. He remembered every face, every conversation fragment, every moment when powerful people forgot he was human and spoke freely about their schemes, their fears, their crimes. In his mind, Daniel kept files more comprehensive than any FBI dossier, chronicles of corruption written in whispered confessions and careless admissions. The residents of 845 Park Avenue lived in a bubble of inherited wealth and aggressive ambition. Old money mixed uneasily with new, creating tensions that Daniel observed like an anthropologist studying a foreign tribe. The pharmaceutical heiress looked down on the tech mogul because his fortune was too recent, too flashy. The oil executive's family considered themselves American royalty, their wealth spanning generations of environmental destruction disguised as progress. Drake Harrison occupied the penthouse, a $45 million monument to everything money could buy and nothing it couldn't. His apartment stretched across the entire 42nd floor, with panoramic windows that offered a god's-eye view of Central Park. Drake had earned his billions through a combination of pharmaceutical patents, military contracts, and cryptocurrency investments that had multiplied his initial fortune like digital magic. But Daniel had watched Drake for 3 years, and he saw what others missed. Behind the perfectly tailored Italian suits and Swiss watches, behind the collection of vintage cars and Byzantine art, Drake carried himself like a man running from something. His shoulders were always slightly hunched, as if expecting a blow from behind. His eyes darted constantly, checking exits, calculating escape routes, scanning faces for signs of recognition or threat. Drake's wealth was a fortress built to hide his past, and Daniel had pieced together fragments of that hidden history through overheard phone calls and carelessly discarded documents. Drake hadn't always been a billionaire. He'd grown up in a Detroit trailer park, the son of a factory worker who died young from asbestos poisoning. His original name wasn't Drake Harrison, it was Derek Kowalski, and he'd legally changed it when his first business venture succeeded, erasing his Polish immigrant roots like chalk marks on a blackboard. Daniel understood shame. He'd felt it himself, growing up poor in San Juan before Maria convinced him to move to New York for a better life. But Daniel had never tried to hide where he came from. His accent still carried traces of the island, and he wore his history like a comfortable old shirt, faded but honest. Drake's shame was different, toxic, consuming, a cancer that ate away at his capacity for human connection. The irony wasn't lost on Daniel. Here was a man worth billions of dollars, living in a penthouse that cost more than most small countries' annual budgets, yet he was terrified of being seen as poor. Meanwhile, Daniel, who earned $32,000 a year and lived in a studio apartment, carried himself with the quiet dignity of a king. Wealth, Daniel had learned, was not about money. It was about knowing who you were and being proud of the journey that brought you there. As the seasons changed and Daniel's 15th year at 845 Park Avenue approached, he had no idea that his invisible life was about to collide with Drake's visible lies in ways that would transform them both. The building's marble halls, which had witnessed so many secrets, were about to become the stage for a drama that would test everything Daniel believed about justice, forgiveness, and the true meaning of dignity. The seeds of their collision had been planted in small moments, a misplaced document here, an overheard conversation there, a USB drive discovered behind a loose security panel. Daniel couldn't know that his careful attention to detail and his invisible presence were about to become the most powerful forces in the building, more valuable than all the cryptocurrency wallets and stock portfolios combined. In his small apartment in Washington Heights, Daniel would soon find himself holding the key to secrets that could topple empires and destroy lives. But more importantly, he would discover that sometimes the most profound power comes not from wealth or position, but from the simple act of remaining true to yourself when everyone around you has forgotten who they used to be. Drake Harrison paced his penthouse office like a caged predator, his Italian leather shoes silent against the Persian rug that cost more than most people's cars. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan spread out beneath him like a glittering circuit board, each light representing another stream of revenue, another opportunity to multiply his vast fortune. But tonight, none of that wealth could solve his most pressing problem. The crisis had begun 3 weeks earlier with a phone call that made his blood turn to ice. His half-sister Rebecca, whom he hadn't spoken to in 15 years, was getting married to the heir of a pharmaceutical empire in Boston. The wedding would be attended by old New England money, the kind of families whose wealth stretched back to the Mayflower and whose social registers read like a who's who of American aristocracy. Rebecca had tracked down his unlisted number through a private investigator, her voice carrying the same Detroit accent he'd spent millions trying to erase from his own speech. "Derek," she had said, using his real name like a weapon, "I'm inviting you to my wedding. It's time the family met my successful brother." The invitation itself was a masterpiece of elegant stationery, printed on paper so thick it felt like fabric. Drake had stared at the gold-embossed letters until they blurred, his hands trembling with a rage he hadn't felt since childhood. Rebecca knew exactly what she was doing, forcing him to choose between exposing his carefully constructed identity or missing the social event that could legitimize him among Boston's pharmaceutical elite. His business empire had been built on strategic partnerships with exactly the kind of families who would be attending this wedding. His latest pharmaceutical venture, a revolutionary cancer treatment, required FDA connections and regulatory influence that only old money could provide. Missing the wedding would be professional suicide, but attending meant risking exposure of everything he'd worked to hide. Drake had tried every solution money could buy. He'd offered Rebecca $1 million to postpone the wedding. She'd laughed and hung up on him. He'd hired genealogists to create a false family history. But Rebecca had childhood photographs and school records that would contradict any fiction. He'd even considered not attending at all, but his business partners had already RSVP'd on his behalf, assuming he'd want to network at such an exclusive gathering. The pharmaceutical merger alone was worth $800 million. His cryptocurrency investments had multiplied his wealth exponentially, with Bitcoin holdings that fluctuated by millions daily. His real estate portfolio included properties from Manhattan to Monaco, each one a monument to his success. But none of that mattered if Rebecca decided to share family stories about growing up in the Riverside Mobile Home Park, about their father who died coughing up black blood in a VA hospital, about the Christmas when they ate government cheese and pretended it was a feast. Daniel first noticed something unusual about Drake's behavior on a Tuesday morning in early October. Normally, Drake moved through the building's lobby with the confident stride of a man who owned everything he surveyed. But that morning, his steps were hesitant, his usual commanding presence replaced by something that looked almost like fear. Daniel was polishing the brass elevator buttons, a task that required him to remain perfectly still while appearing completely invisible. Over the years, he'd perfected this art, the ability to become so thoroughly background that wealthy residents forgot he had ears, eyes, and a functioning brain. It was during these moments of assumed invisibility that he learned the most about the building's secrets. Drake was speaking into his phone in urgent, hushed tones that echoed off the marble walls. "I don't care what it costs," he was saying, his voice tight with desperation. "Find someone who can pass for educated, someone with gray hair and dignity. I need a clean background, no criminal record, someone who won't ask questions." Daniel's hand paused on the brass button as he processed what he was hearing. Drake was looking for someone to hire, someone to pretend to be something they weren't. The conversation continued as Drake paced near the building's main entrance, his reflection multiplied in the polished surfaces surrounding him. "It's not fraud," Drake insisted to whoever was on the other end of the call. "It's a family dinner. One evening, maybe 6 hours total. He just needs to sit there, look respectable, and not contradict anything I say about our relationship." Daniel understood immediately. Drake was hiring someone to pretend to be his father, to create the illusion of respectability that his real family history couldn't provide. It was a deception so profound, so deeply rooted in shame, that Daniel felt an unexpected wave of sympathy for the billionaire. The irony was exquisite. Here was a man who could buy and sell most small countries, reduced to begging strangers to help him hide from his own past. Drake's fortune was built on pharmaceutical patents that had made life-saving treatments accessible to millions, yet he couldn't cure his own disease of self-hatred. His cryptocurrency investments had made him richer than kings, but he remained spiritually bankrupt. Over the following days, Daniel watched as Drake's search became increasingly desperate. Professional actors were too recognizable, potentially creating more problems than they solved. Hired escorts had backgrounds too questionable for such a high-stakes environment. Corporate consultants lacked the natural dignity needed to convincingly portray a patriarch of pharmaceutical wealth. Daniel observed these failed attempts with the patience of a man who'd learned to find entertainment in other people's struggles. He watched Drake interview candidates in his private office, their voices carrying through the ventilation system he knew better than the building's blueprints. Each rejection drove Drake further toward panic, his carefully controlled exterior cracking like ice on a warming lake. 2 weeks before the wedding, Daniel was replacing air fresheners in the penthouse hallway. When Drake emerged from his office, shoulders slumped in defeat. Their eyes met for perhaps the first time in 15 years, and Daniel saw something he'd never witnessed before: a powerful man completely out of options. "Daniel," Drake said, his voice carrying none of its usual commanding authority. "How long have you worked here?" 15 years, sir," Daniel replied, his tone neutral, professional. Drake studied him as if seeing him for the first time. Daniel stood 5 feet 8 inches tall, with silver hair that had gone gray gracefully, lines around his eyes that spoke of wisdom earned through hardship, and hands that showed the honest calluses of a man who'd never been afraid of work. His uniform was always immaculate, his posture straight with natural dignity. "You're Puerto Rican," Drake said, and it wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. From San Juan originally." Drake nodded slowly, his mind clearly working through calculations that had nothing to do with money. "Daniel, I have a proposition for you, a business arrangement that would be mutually beneficial." Daniel waited, his expression revealing nothing. 15 years of invisibility had taught him that silence was often more powerful than speech. "I need someone to accompany me to a family wedding in Boston, someone who can play a role, someone dignified, someone who commands respect." Drake's voice grew stronger as he spoke, his natural salesmanship reasserting itself. "The compensation would be substantial. $50,000 for one evening's work." $50,000. Daniel's annual salary was barely more than $32,000, and Drake was offering almost 2 years' wages for 6 hours of pretense. It was enough money to fix his apartment's heating system, to send something meaningful to his sister's family in Puerto Rico, to finally replace the refrigerator that had been dying a slow death for 3 years. But Daniel understood exactly what Drake was asking. He wanted Daniel to pretend to be his father, to sit at a table surrounded by pharmaceutical royalty, and nod approvingly as Drake told lies about their shared history. He wanted Daniel to legitimize a fiction, to become complicit in the very shame that was eating Drake alive. "What exactly would this role involve, Mr. Harrison?" Daniel asked, his voice carefully neutral. Drake's relief was visible, his shoulders relaxing slightly at Daniel's apparent willingness to consider the offer. "You'd be my father. We'd say you were in the pharmaceutical business yourself, maybe a researcher or a company founder. You'd have a distinguished background, educated, successful. Nothing too complicated. Mostly you just need to sit there and look proud. Daniel nodded slowly, understanding the full scope of the deception. Drake wasn't just hiring an actor, he was purchasing a new history, a clean bloodline that would erase the trailer park and the factory worker and the young man who died choking on industrial dreams. "I'd need time to consider this offer carefully, Mr. Harrison," Daniel said finally. "Of course," Drake replied quickly, "but I need an answer by Friday. The wedding is next weekend." As Daniel rode the subway home that evening, his mind churned through the implications of Drake's offer. $50,000 would change his life, provide security he'd never experienced, but it would also make him complicit in a lie that went deeper than simple deception. It was a denial of dignity itself, an assertion that working-class roots were something shameful that needed to be hidden. In his studio apartment, sitting beneath Maria's photograph, Daniel wondered what his late wife would have advised. Maria had always been the moral compass in their relationship, the one who could see through complex situations to their ethical core. She'd grown up poor too, but she'd worn her history like jewelry, proud of how far they'd traveled from their humble beginnings. The building superintendent's job at 845 Park Avenue had been Maria's idea. "You'll be invisible to them," she'd said with a knowing smile, "but you'll see everything. And someday, that knowledge might be worth more than any salary they could pay you." Now, 5 years after Maria's death, her words seemed prophetic. Daniel had indeed seen everything, cataloged every secret, witnessed every weakness among the building's wealthy residents. And here was Drake, unknowingly offering him a front-row seat to the most intimate secrets of all, the shame that drove his entire existence. But Daniel also understood that accepting Drake's offer would mean betraying everything he'd learned about dignity in his 62 years of life. It would mean telling the world that his own background, the factory workers and hotel maids and grocery clerks who'd raised him, wasn't good enough for polite society. As he fell asleep that night, Daniel realized that Drake's proposition was more than a business offer. It was a test of character, a moment when he would have to choose between financial security and spiritual integrity. And despite the temptation of $50,000, Daniel already knew what his answer would be. Outside his window, Manhattan glittered with the wealth of people who'd forgotten where they came from. But inside his small apartment, surrounded by the honest poverty that had shaped him, Daniel Rodriguez prepared to teach a billionaire that dignity couldn't be purchased at any price. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, with October wind rattling the windows of 845 Park Avenue like impatient fingers. Daniel had spent the entire week wrestling with Drake's proposition, the offer of $50,000 growing heavier in his mind with each passing day. He'd calculated and recalculated what that money could mean. Medical bills paid, his sister's children in Puerto Rico given opportunities he'd never had, a small nest egg for the retirement that seemed impossible on his current salary. But every time he imagined himself sitting at that elegant Boston table, nodding as Drake spun lies about their manufactured relationship, something in his chest tightened like a fist. Maria's voice whispered in his memory, reminding him of conversations they'd had about the wealthy residents, about how money could buy almost everything except the one thing it wanted most: authenticity. Drake had been calling the penthouse elevator more frequently than usual, each summons another opportunity to pressure Daniel for an answer. The building's other staff had noticed the unusual attention their colleague was receiving from the most powerful resident, and Daniel could feel their curious glances like pinpricks against his skin. He'd always been nearly invisible in this place, and sudden visibility felt like standing naked under fluorescent lights. At precisely 2 o'clock that Friday afternoon, Daniel knocked on the penthouse office door. Drake's assistant, a sharp-featured woman whose entire wardrobe probably cost more than Daniel's annual rent, gestured him inside with barely concealed impatience. The office itself, was a temple to pharmaceutical wealth, walls lined with award plaques, photographs of Drake shaking hands with senators and foreign ministers, and a glass display case containing the original patent documents for the cancer treatments that had launched his fortune into the stratosphere. Drake stood with his back to the door, staring out at Central Park spread below like a green carpet among the urban canyons. His reflection in the window showed a man who hadn't slept well. Dark circles beneath his eyes despite having access to the world's finest healthcare and pharmaceutical treatments. "Daniel," Drake said without turning around, "I assume you've made your decision." "Yes, sir, Mr. Harrison. I have." Drake turned then, his face a carefully constructed mask of confident expectation. But Daniel saw through the facade to the desperation underneath, the way a drowning man might look at a rope thrown from shore. "I'm honored by your offer," Daniel began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to say. $50,000 is more money than I've ever been offered for anything, but I can't pretend to be your father. The transformation in Drake's expression was immediate and devastating. The mask of confidence cracked like thin ice, revealing something raw and vulnerable that made Daniel almost regret his decision. Almost. "I don't understand," Drake said, his voice tight with controlled desperation. "The money isn't enough? I could go higher. 75,000, 100,000. Name your price, Daniel." "It's not about money, Mr. Harrison." "Everything's about money," Drake shot back, his composure finally cracking. "Everything can be bought, Daniel. Everyone has a price. What's yours? 200,000? $500,000? Daniel stood perfectly still, letting Drake's words echo off the office walls lined with pharmaceutical patents and cryptocurrency investment certificates. When the silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, he spoke with the quiet dignity that 15 years of invisibility had taught him. "My father was Ramon Rodriguez. He worked in a sugarcane factory in Puerto Rico for 38 years. His hands were permanently stained from the machinery, and he never earned more than $8,000 in any single year of his life." Daniel's voice grew stronger as he spoke, each word carrying the weight of absolute truth. "He died when I was 22, and his funeral cost more than he made in 6 months. But he was my father, Mr. Harrison. Not because he was wealthy or educated or connected to the right people. Because he taught me that dignity doesn't come from what you own. It comes from who you are when no one's watching." Drake stared at him as if he were speaking a foreign language. "This is business, Daniel. One evening of acting, nothing more. You'd be helping me secure deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I'd be helping you lie about who you are." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge thrown down by a much smaller man to a giant. Drake's wealth surrounded them, the handcrafted furniture that cost more than cars, the art collection worth millions, the view of Manhattan that represented ownership of one of the world's most expensive real estates. But in that moment, Daniel's refusal carried more power than all of Drake's accumulated capital. "You don't understand what you're walking away from," Drake said, his voice shifting from desperation to something darker. "This isn't just about one evening. The connections I'd make at this wedding could revolutionize cancer treatment worldwide. My pharmaceutical research could save millions of lives. You're putting your pride ahead of the greater good." Daniel nodded slowly, recognizing the rationalization for what it was, a wealthy man's attempt to transform selfishness into nobility. "Maybe that's true, Mr. Harrison. But I've spent 15 years watching wealthy people convince themselves that their lies serve some higher purpose, and I've learned that dignity sacrificed for any reason is still dignity lost." Drake's face flushed with an anger that seemed to surprise him. For perhaps the first time in decades, someone had refused something he desperately needed, and money couldn't solve the problem. His pharmaceutical empire, built on breakthrough treatments and strategic partnerships, suddenly felt fragile as tissue paper. "You're making a mistake, Daniel, a very expensive mistake." The threat was subtle but clear, and Daniel understood immediately that his job was now in jeopardy. 15 years of loyal service, of keeping secrets and maintaining silence, could be erased with a single phone call to building management. Drake had the power to destroy Daniel's livelihood, to make him unemployable in Manhattan's competitive service industry. But as Daniel looked into Drake's eyes, he saw something that gave him an unexpected moment of clarity. Drake wasn't just afraid of being exposed as poor, he was terrified of being seen as ordinary. His entire identity had been constructed around the fiction that he was somehow naturally superior, that his wealth reflected inherent worthiness rather than circumstance and luck. Daniel's refusal threatened that fiction at its foundation. "I understand, Mr. Harrison," Daniel said quietly. "You have to do what you think is right." He turned to leave, but Drake's voice stopped him at the door. "Why?" The single word carried years of incomprehension, a billionaire's genuine confusion at encountering something money couldn't purchase. Daniel turned back, seeing Drake not as the powerful penthouse resident, but as a frightened man whose pharmaceutical fortune couldn't cure his deepest sickness, the shame that poisoned everything it touched. "Because pretending to be your father would dishonor us both," Daniel said simply. "Your real father was probably a good man who did his best with what he had. And my real father taught me that authenticity is the only inheritance that really matters." As Daniel walked toward the elevator, he felt the weight of his decision settling over him like a comfortable old coat. Behind him, he could hear Drake making phone calls, his voice sharp with the kind of anger that came from being denied something for the first time in decades. Daniel knew his job was probably forfeit, knew that he'd just walked away from more money than he'd ever see again. But riding down in the elevator he'd polished countless times, surrounded by the marble and gold that represented everything he'd never owned, Daniel Rodriguez felt richer than he had in years. He'd been offered a chance to betray everything his father had taught him, and he'd chosen dignity instead. In a building full of people who'd sold pieces of their souls for stock options and pharmaceutical patents, he remained whole. The following Monday brought the consequences Daniel had expected. Building management called him into a sterile office that smelled of fresh paint and legal documents, where a woman in an expensive suit explained that his services would no longer be required at 845 Park Avenue. They offered him 2 weeks severance pay and a letter of recommendation so generic it could have been written by artificial intelligence. "Budget cuts," she explained, not meeting his eyes. "The building is implementing cost-saving measures across all departments." Daniel signed the termination papers with the same steady hand that had been polishing brass and mopping marble for 15 years. As he cleaned out his small locker in the building's basement, removing the few personal items he'd accumulated over a decade and a half, he felt no bitterness, only the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd looked temptation in the face and chosen character instead. Walking out of 845 Park Avenue for the last time, carrying his possessions in a cardboard box, Daniel didn't look back at the towering monument to pharmaceutical wealth in Manhattan real estate. Instead, he focused on the subway entrance ahead, on the journey home to Washington Heights, on the uncertain but authentic future that stretched before him like a path he'd chosen to walk, with his head held high. Behind him, in his penthouse office, Drake Harrison stared out at Central Park and wondered why his victory felt so much like defeat. He'd removed the obstacle to his plans, eliminated the one person who'd refused to be bought. But the reflection staring back at him from the window looked like a stranger, a wealthy man who'd just discovered that money couldn't purchase the thing he needed most. The wedding in Boston was only 4 days away, and Drake still had no solution to his fundamental problem. He'd won the battle against Daniel's integrity, but he was losing the war against his own shame. And somewhere in the pharmaceutical deals and cryptocurrency investments that comprised his vast fortune, he was beginning to suspect that he'd traded away something far more valuable than anything his wealth could buy back. The unemployment office in Lower Manhattan smelled like desperation and industrial disinfectant, a sharp contrast to the perfumed luxury Daniel had breathed for 15 years. He sat in a plastic chair that had been designed for efficiency rather than comfort, watching other displaced workers shuffle through a system that treated human dignity like a statistical variable. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd chosen authenticity over financial security, and now he was learning the price of that choice in the most concrete terms possible. His unemployment benefits would provide barely enough to cover rent and groceries, leaving no margin for the small luxuries that had made his previous life bearable. The occasional dinner at the Puerto Rican restaurant on Broadway, the monthly flowers he still bought for Maria's grave, the modest donations he'd been able to send to his sister's family back in San Juan. For 6 weeks, Daniel applied for building superintendent positions throughout Manhattan, but his connection to 845 Park Avenue had somehow become toxic. Property management companies would express initial interest, then grow cold after checking his references. He began to suspect that Drake's influence extended far beyond pharmaceutical patents and cryptocurrency investments into the interconnected world of Manhattan real estate. The rejection letters, when they came at all, were politely vague. After careful consideration, not quite the right fit, pursuing other candidates. Each phrase was a small violence, death by 1,000 cuts, administered through corporate politeness. Daniel had worked in the service industry his entire adult life, and he understood the coded language. He'd been blacklisted. By December, with his savings dwindling and winter settling over the city like an unforgiving landlord, Daniel was forced to take part-time work wherever he could find it. 3 mornings a week, he cleaned offices in the financial district for a company that paid cash and asked no questions about previous employment. 2 evenings a week, he swept floors at a grocery store in the Bronx, working alongside immigrants who spoke in Spanish about dreams that grew smaller with each passing day. The physical work didn't bother him. His hands had never been afraid of honest labor. But the invisibility was different now, tinged with defeat rather than dignity. At 845 Park Avenue, he'd been invisible by choice, a strategic observer who understood his role in the building's ecosystem. Now he was invisible because society had decided he was disposable, a 62-year-old man whose skills had been deemed suddenly worthless. During those long months of unemployment and underemployment, Daniel had plenty of time to think about Drake's wedding, to wonder if the billionaire had found someone else to play his father, or if he'd faced his fears alone. Part of him, a small, ungenerous part, hoped that Drake had been exposed, that his carefully constructed identity had crumbled in front of Boston's pharmaceutical elite. But mostly, Daniel found himself thinking about dignity and what it meant to maintain it when the world seemed determined to strip it away. His father, Ramon Rodriguez, had faced similar challenges during the economic downturns that periodically devastated Puerto Rico's sugar industry. Daniel remembered conversations from his childhood, his father explaining that a man's worth wasn't determined by his employment status, but by how he treated others and how he faced adversity. "Mijo," his father had said during one particularly difficult period, "they can take away your job, your money, even your home, but they cannot take away who you are unless you let them." Those words echoed through Daniel's mind as he mopped office floors at 5 in the morning, as he swept grocery store aisles while families rushed past him like he was part of the fixtures. He'd refused Drake's offer to preserve his dignity, but now he was learning that dignity was something that had to be actively maintained, chosen fresh each day regardless of circumstances. The winter was brutal, with heating costs that forced Daniel to choose between warmth and food more often than pride would allow him to admit. His studio apartment in Washington Heights became a careful ecosystem of survival, layers of blankets, hot water bottles, and the kind of resourcefulness that poverty teaches to those who live long enough to learn its lessons. One particularly cold January evening, as Daniel was walking home from his grocery store shift, he noticed a familiar figure stumbling along the sidewalk near the 181st Street subway station. It was Miguel Santos, a former co-worker from 845 Park Avenue who'd been laid off the same day as Daniel. But where Daniel had maintained his sobriety and dignity despite his circumstances, Miguel had chosen a different path through his desperation. "Daniel, hermano," Miguel called out, his voice thick with alcohol and something harder. "Look at us, man. Look what that building did to us." Daniel helped Miguel to a nearby bus stop bench, noting the way his former colleague's hands shook and his clothes hung loose on a frame that had lost too much weight too quickly. Miguel had been a good worker, a family man with 3 children and a wife who cleaned houses in New Jersey. His termination from 845 Park Avenue had apparently triggered a cascade of failures that left him homeless and addicted. "What happened to fighting the system, Daniel?" Miguel asked, his eyes unfocused, but his anger sharp. "You said we deserved better, that they couldn't treat us like disposable equipment. Where's the dignity in this?" Daniel sat beside Miguel in the cold, their breath forming clouds that dissipated quickly in the winter air. "The dignity is in getting up tomorrow and trying again. The dignity is in not letting them change who we are inside." Miguel laughed bitterly. Easy words for a man who's never had children depending on him. "My kids are living with my wife's sister in Newark because I can't afford rent. My dignity doesn't keep them warm at night." The conversation haunted Daniel as he continued his journey home. Miguel's words contained a truth he'd been trying to ignore. His own situation was difficult but manageable because he had only himself to support. The luxury of choosing dignity over financial security was available to him precisely because his choices didn't affect anyone else's survival. That night, in his small apartment beneath Maria's photograph, Daniel wondered if he'd been naive. If his refusal to help Drake had been more about pride than principle. Would Maria have made the same choice? Would his father have turned down $50,000 that could have changed their lives? But as he drifted off to sleep, wrapped in every blanket he owned, Daniel knew the answer. Ramon Rodriguez had faced his own moments of choice, opportunities to compromise his values for temporary gain. And every time, he'd chosen the harder path, the one that let him sleep peacefully despite empty pockets. Meanwhile, across the city in his heated penthouse, Drake Harrison was discovering that removing Daniel had solved none of his fundamental problems. The wedding in Boston had been a disaster of spectacular proportions. Without Daniel, or any convincing substitute, Drake had been forced to attend alone, claiming his father was too ill to travel. Rebecca had seen through the lie immediately and spent the evening regaling pharmaceutical aristocrats with stories from their childhood, stories that painted Drake's transformation from Derek Kowalski into pharmaceutical mogul as something closer to fraud than success. The business deals Drake had hoped to secure never materialized. Worse, several existing partnerships had begun to cool as rumors spread through pharmaceutical circles about his manufactured identity. Stock prices for his biotech ventures had dropped 14% in the weeks following the wedding, and his cryptocurrency investments were performing poorly in a market that seemed to punish any sign of instability. But the financial losses were nothing compared to the deeper damage. Drake had successfully eliminated Daniel from his life, but he couldn't eliminate the memory of their conversation, the way the janitor had spoken about dignity with more authority than Drake had ever possessed despite his billions. Every morning, looking out at Central Park from his floor-to-ceiling windows, Drake found himself thinking about Ramon Rodriguez, the sugarcane worker whose son had valued authenticity over money. The building felt different without Daniel. Small systems that had operated seamlessly for 15 years began to break down. Deliveries were misrouted, security protocols were ignored, and the marble floors never quite achieved the mirror shine that Daniel had maintained through meticulous daily care. The new cleaning staff worked efficiently but without love, and the difference was visible in ways that annoyed Drake more than he could logically explain. By March, with spring beginning to soften Manhattan's harsh edges, both men were learning that their collision had changed them permanently. Daniel was surviving his exile with dignity intact, but resources depleted, while Drake was thriving financially but spiritually bankrupted. One had chosen authenticity and was paying the price in material comfort. The other had chosen wealth and was discovering that some prices are too high, even for billionaires. Neither could have predicted that their separation was only temporary, that forces beyond their control were already aligning to bring them back together in ways that would test everything they'd learned about dignity, forgiveness, and the true meaning of wealth. Spring in New York brought the kind of renewal that made even the hardest neighborhoods feel touched by possibility. Daniel had survived the winter, though the effort had carved new lines around his eyes and added silver to his already gray hair. His part-time work at the financial district offices and the Bronx grocery store had developed into a routine that, while far from comfortable, provided just enough to cover his basic needs. But those same spring months brought an unexpected disruption to the carefully maintained systems at 845 Park Avenue. Without Daniel's experienced oversight, the building's invisible infrastructure had begun showing stress fractures that no amount of pharmaceutical wealth could easily repair. The problems started small. Packages were delivered to wrong floors, creating angry exchanges between residents accustomed to perfect service. Security cameras developed blind spots when cleaning crews unknowingly repositioned them. The marble floors, despite daily attention from a professional cleaning service, never achieved the mirror shine that Daniel had maintained through years of patient, meticulous care. More significantly, the building's carefully guarded atmosphere of discretion began to erode. The new cleaning staff, lacking Daniel's institutional memory and diplomatic skills, inadvertently overheard and repeated conversations that should have remained private. Pharmaceutical executives found their business discussions echoing through building corridors. Cryptocurrency transactions that should have been confidential became gossip shared among service workers who didn't understand the value of strategic silence. Drake noticed these changes from his penthouse, though he would never have admitted that Daniel's absence was contributing to the building's deteriorating standards. Instead, he blamed the property management company, threatening lawsuits and demanding the kind of perfection that money should be able to buy but somehow couldn't achieve. The crisis that would ultimately reunite them began with something as mundane as a missing package. But in Drake's world, no package was truly mundane. On a Tuesday morning in early April, a courier delivered an envelope marked "Confidential Pharmaceutical Patent Documentation" to the building's front desk. The package contained final FDA approval documents for Drake's latest cancer treatment breakthrough, papers worth potentially billions of dollars in future pharmaceutical revenue. Under Daniel's system, such deliveries would have been immediately secured and personally delivered to Drake's office within minutes of arrival. But the new protocol relied on digital tracking systems and multiple handoffs between staff members who didn't fully understand the critical nature of their responsibilities. Somewhere between the front desk and the penthouse elevator, the envelope disappeared. Drake's reaction was explosive in the way that only pharmaceutical billionaires could achieve, controlled fury backed by unlimited resources and connections that extended from Wall Street to Washington, D.C. Within hours, he'd hired a private security firm to investigate the missing documents, threatened lawsuits against the building management company, and contacted federal authorities about potential industrial espionage. The investigation quickly focused on the cleaning staff, particularly the evening crew that had access to all building areas and would have had opportunity to steal confidential documents. Security cameras were reviewed frame by frame. Phone records were subpoenaed. Background checks were conducted on every service employee who'd worked in the building during the relevant time frame. But as days passed and the investigation consumed thousands of dollars in pharmaceutical company resources, the missing documents remained missing. Drake's legal team explained that without the original FDA approval papers, his new cancer treatment would face regulatory delays that could cost millions in lost revenue, and more importantly, delay potentially life-saving treatments for cancer patients worldwide. The pressure was enormous. The stakes measured not just in cryptocurrency gains or pharmaceutical profits, but in human lives affected by medical breakthroughs. Drake found himself facing the possibility that his own security failures, his decision to dismiss Daniel and disrupt systems that had worked flawlessly for 15 years, might have contributed to a loss that could impact global healthcare. It was Drake's personal assistant, reviewing building employee records while coordinating with the private investigators who first mentioned Daniel's name. There was a custodial worker who was terminated last fall, she reported during a late-night strategy meeting in Drake's office. 15-year employee with perfect security clearance. He might have insights into building protocols that could help the investigation. Drake's reaction was immediate and viscerous. The thought of contacting Daniel felt like admitting defeat, acknowledging that his decision to fire the janitor had been a mistake, with consequences extending far beyond personal pride. His pharmaceutical empire was built on never admitting errors, on projecting the kind of confidence that attracted investors and impressed FDA regulators. But as April stretched into May and the missing documents remained unfound, Drake began to face an uncomfortable truth that his wealth couldn't shield him from. He needed Daniel Rodriguez. The realization came to him at 3 a.m, standing at his penthouse windows looking down at Central Park bathed in spring moonlight. For months, he'd convinced himself that Daniel was replaceable, that dignity and institutional memory were less valuable than cryptocurrency portfolios and pharmaceutical patents. But the chaos consuming his building suggested otherwise. Daniel possessed something that couldn't be purchased or replicated. 15 years of accumulated knowledge about how 845 Park Avenue actually functioned beneath its marble surfaces. He'd understood the building's rhythms, its residents' habits, its hidden vulnerabilities. More than that, he'd been trusted because he'd earned that trust through consistent, honest service. The missing FDA documents were just the visible symptom of a deeper problem. Drake had destroyed a system that worked, replacing competence with cost-cutting and experience with efficiency algorithms. His pharmaceutical business success had made him believe that all problems could be solved through strategic resource allocation, but Daniel's absence was teaching him that some assets were irreplaceable. By morning, Drake had made his decision. He would contact Daniel Rodriguez and ask for his help, not as employer to employee, but as one man appealing to another for assistance that couldn't be commanded or purchased. It would be the first time in decades that Drake had voluntarily placed himself in a position of needing someone who had every reason to refuse him. The decision felt both necessary and terrifying, like a pharmaceutical treatment that might cure the disease but permanently change the patient. Drake was about to learn whether Daniel's dignity was accompanied by forgiveness, whether the man he'd dismissed and blacklisted would be willing to help prevent a crisis that could affect both their lives in ways neither could fully predict. In his small apartment in Washington Heights, Daniel remained unaware that his expertise was desperately needed by the billionaire who destroyed his career. He continued his routine of part-time work and careful budgeting, his dignity intact, but his resources stretched thin. Soon, a phone call would interrupt his quiet exile, offering him a chance to demonstrate that true power sometimes belonged to those who appeared to have none at all. The phone call came on a Thursday evening in mid-May, as Daniel was preparing the simple dinner that had become his nightly ritual. Rice and beans with a small piece of chicken, the same meal his mother had cooked when money was tight and love was abundant. His ancient telephone, a landline relic from an era when privacy couldn't be hacked or monitored, rang with the sharp insistence of unexpected news. "Mr. Rodriguez, this is Drake Harrison. I need to speak with you." Daniel set down his wooden spoon and stared at the phone as if it had spontaneously burst into flames. Drake's voice carried none of its usual commanding authority. Instead, it sounded hollow, tired, touched by something that might have been desperation. "Mr. Harrison," Daniel replied, his tone carefully neutral. "I know I have no right to ask this, Daniel. I know what I did to you was wrong." The words came quickly, as if Drake feared he might lose courage if he paused. "But there's been a crisis at the building. Documents have gone missing. Important pharmaceutical documents that could affect cancer treatment research worldwide. The investigation has stalled, and I think you might be the only person who understands the building well enough to help us figure out what happened." Daniel listened in silence, processing not just the words but the transformation in Drake's tone. This was not the arrogant billionaire who'd fired him without cause, but a man who'd been humbled by circumstances beyond his pharmaceutical wealth and cryptocurrency investments. "What exactly are you asking me to do, Mr. Harrison?" "Come back to the building, not permanently," Drake added quickly. "Just as a consultant. Help the investigators understand how the security systems really work, how someone might have accessed restricted areas. The private security firm we hired doesn't understand the building's culture, its informal protocols." The irony was exquisite. Drake was asking Daniel to solve a problem that had likely been created by Daniel's own termination, to fix systems that had operated flawlessly for 15 years, until Drake's pride had demanded Daniel's removal. "And the compensation?" Daniel asked, because Maria had taught him that dignity didn't prohibit practical considerations. "Whatever you consider fair. Name your price." Daniel almost smiled at that. 6 months earlier, Drake had offered him $50,000 to betray his principles. Now he was offering unlimited compensation for Daniel to be exactly who he'd always been, an honest man who understood his work better than anyone else. "I'll need access to all building records, security footage, staff schedules," Daniel said finally, "and I'll need to speak directly with the cleaning crews, the security guards, everyone who might have relevant information." "Done. Anything you need. I'll be there Monday morning at 7 o'clock. After Drake hung up, Daniel sat in his small kitchen for a long time, staring at his half-prepared dinner. Part of him felt vindicated. Drake's call was an admission that Daniel's expertise had been irreplaceable, that 15 years of institutional knowledge couldn't be easily replicated or purchased. But another part of him felt sad for Drake, recognizing the pharmaceutical billionaire's desperation. Whatever had been stolen must be genuinely important, valuable enough to force a man who never admitted mistakes to swallow his pride and contact someone he'd wronged. Daniel understood that this was more than a consulting opportunity. It was a chance for redemption, not just his own, but Drake's as well. The missing documents had created a crisis that might allow both men to discover whether their collision months earlier had taught them anything valuable about dignity, forgiveness, and the true meaning of worth. Monday morning found Daniel standing in the familiar marble lobby of 845 Park Avenue, but his perspective had been fundamentally altered by 6 months of exile. The building still gleamed with pharmaceutical wealth and Manhattan real estate prestige, but he no longer felt invisible within its walls. Instead, he felt like a specialist called in to diagnose a complex problem that lesser minds couldn't solve. Drake met him at the main entrance, and the transformation was immediately visible. The billionaire had lost weight, his expensive suits hanging slightly loose on a frame that seemed diminished by stress. His eyes, once sharp with arrogant confidence, now carried the hollow look of a man who'd discovered that cryptocurrency portfolios and pharmaceutical patents couldn't solve every problem. "Daniel," Drake said, extending his hand, "thank you for coming." Daniel shook the offered hand, noting how Drake's grip lacked its former aggressive firmness. "What can you tell me about the missing documents?" They rode the elevator to Drake's penthouse office, where a conference table had been covered with investigation files, security camera printouts, and employee background records. The private security firm had generated hundreds of pages of analysis, but Daniel could see immediately that they'd been asking the wrong questions. "The envelope disappeared sometime between noon and 4 p.m. last Tuesday," Drake explained, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd explained the same facts dozens of times. "It contained FDA approval documents for a new cancer treatment. The pharmaceutical implications are enormous, potentially hundreds of millions in research validation." Daniel studied the security camera footage, noting gaps in coverage that the professional investigators had missed. He recognized the blind spots he'd long ago memorized, areas where someone with institutional knowledge could move undetected if they understood the building's rhythms. "Who knew about the delivery?" Daniel asked. "Only myself, my assistant, and the building's front desk staff." Daniel nodded, already forming theories. After 15 years of invisible observation, he understood that the most important information in places like 845 Park Avenue was usually shared through informal networks rather than official channels. Pharmaceutical secrets weren't stolen by sophisticated espionage operations. They were lost through careless conversations and trusted access. Over the following 3 days, Daniel interviewed every staff member who'd been working the day the documents disappeared. His approach was different from the private investigators, less interrogation than conversation, the kind of respectful dialogue that service workers rarely experienced from people investigating their potential guilt. The breakthrough came from Maria Santos, a night cleaning supervisor who'd been hired to replace Daniel's oversight responsibilities. She mentioned, almost casually, that she'd noticed something unusual in the building's recycling systems the day after the documents went missing. One of the paper shredders was jammed, she told Daniel during their conversation in the building's maintenance area. The expensive one on the 17th floor, the one the pharmaceutical executives use. I had to call a repair technician to fix it. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. The 17th floor housed overflow offices for Drake's biotech company, spaces used primarily for confidential document storage and sensitive pharmaceutical research reviews. If someone had attempted to destroy evidence, that would be the logical location. Did you save any of the jammed paper? Maria's eyes widened as she realized the implication of Daniel's question. Fragments, maybe. The repair technician might have kept samples to understand what caused the jam. Within hours, Daniel had tracked down the shredder repair technician and recovered small fragments of high-quality paper that matched the description of the missing FDA envelope. More importantly, he'd identified the person with access to the 17th floor during the crucial time period. Drake's ambitious assistant, the same woman who'd been coordinating the investigation while secretly preparing to sell pharmaceutical secrets to competing biotech companies. The confrontation took place in Drake's penthouse office, with Daniel present as both expert witness and moral compass. The assistant broke down quickly when presented with evidence, admitting that she'd stolen the FDA documents to sell to a European pharmaceutical consortium, but had panicked when the investigation began and destroyed them instead. Drake's reaction was measured, professional, focused on legal consequences and damage control rather than personal vindication. But Daniel noticed something else, relief mixed with genuine gratitude, as Drake looked at him across the conference table. "How did you know?" Drake asked after the assistant had been escorted away by security. Daniel smiled slightly. "Because I've been cleaning up other people's messes for 15 years. You learn to look for the mistakes people make when they're in a hurry to hide their guilt." For the first time since Daniel had known him, Drake's expression carried humility instead of arrogance. "I owe you more than consulting fees, Daniel. I owe you an apology, a real one this time." Daniel nodded, accepting the acknowledgement but not needing it for his own validation. He'd already learned that dignity didn't require other people's recognition to remain intact. As he prepared to leave 845 Park Avenue once again, Daniel understood that he'd accomplished more than solving a theft. He'd demonstrated that true expertise couldn't be replaced by expensive security firms or professional investigators. Sometimes the most valuable knowledge was held by the people who appeared most invisible, whose years of quiet observation had given them insights that no amount of pharmaceutical wealth could purchase. The cancer treatment that had been delayed by the theft would eventually reach the market, helping patients worldwide. But more immediately, Daniel had shown both himself and Drake that integrity remained powerful even when it seemed defeated, that dignity could survive exile and emerge stronger than before. His phone would ring again soon, with offers that acknowledged his worth. But for now, Daniel Rodriguez walked out of the marble lobby with something more valuable than any employment contract, the knowledge that he'd remained true to himself through everything, and that authenticity was the rarest treasure in a building full of wealth. The restoration came not as a dramatic gesture, but as a series of quiet conversations that unfolded over the following weeks like flowers opening after a long winter. Drake's first call came 3 days after the theft investigation concluded, his voice carrying none of the commanding authority Daniel remembered from their previous relationship. Daniel, I've been thinking about our conversation. Your father, the sugarcane factory, the dignity that can't be purchased. Drake paused, and Daniel could hear something like uncertainty in the silence. I never told you about my father. You don't have to, Mr. Harrison. Derek. My real name is Derek Kowalski, and my father died in a Detroit VA hospital coughing up black lung from 30 years of factory work. He never made more than $18,000 in any year of his life, but he paid for my college education by working double shifts and skipping meals. Drake's voice grew quieter as he continued. I've spent 20 years trying to erase him, and I just realized that was the most disrespectful thing I could have done to his memory. Daniel listened in his small Washington Heights apartment, understanding that he was witnessing something rare, a wealthy man voluntarily acknowledging shame that ran deeper than pharmaceutical profits or cryptocurrency losses. This wasn't about business or employment. This was about the kind of truth that could only be shared between two men who'd both learned the weight of authenticity. He sounds like he was a good father, Daniel said simply. He was, and I think he would have been proud to meet your father. Two men who understood that honor doesn't require a stock portfolio. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, ranging across topics that had nothing to do with building maintenance or pharmaceutical research. Drake spoke about the trailer park where he'd learned to hide his accent, about the scholarship essays where he'd lied about his background, about the progressive transformation from Derek to Drake that had cost him his connection to everything authentic in his past. Daniel shared stories about Ramon Rodriguez, about sugarcane fields and factory injuries, about a man who died poor but proud, surrounded by family who knew exactly who he was and loved him for it, rather than despite it. They found unexpected common ground in childhood memories of government cheese and thrift store clothes, in fathers who'd sacrificed health for their children's futures. When Drake finally made his formal offer, Director of Building Operations with a salary that reflected 15 years of accumulated expertise, Daniel's acceptance was less about employment than about the possibility of redemption for both men. They'd learned something about each other that couldn't be unlearned, had shared truths that created a foundation stronger than any employment contract. Daniel's return to 845 Park Avenue was met with quiet satisfaction from the building's staff and residents who'd witnessed the chaos that had followed his termination. The marble floors quickly regained their mirror shine, packages were delivered efficiently to correct addresses, and the building's atmosphere of discreet professionalism was restored through Daniel's patient attention to systems that had operated seamlessly for 15 years. But the most significant change was in Drake himself, the pharmaceutical billionaire who'd once moved through the building like a conquering emperor, now paused to acknowledge Daniel's work, to ask about his health, to share brief conversations that had nothing to do with service requests or building maintenance. Their relationship evolved into something unprecedented in Drake's adult life, a friendship based on mutual respect rather than financial transaction. Daniel became the person Drake consulted when making decisions that affected the building's community, when pharmaceutical deals raised ethical questions, when the isolation of wealth became too burdensome to bear alone. Daniel, for his part, discovered that his months of exile had given him a perspective on wealth and dignity that made him valuable in ways he'd never expected. He became an informal advisor, not just on building operations, but on the human consequences of business decisions, the moral implications of pharmaceutical pricing, the importance of remembering where you came from even when success took you far from home. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Drake began acknowledging his original name in business dealings, mentioning his father's sacrifice in pharmaceutical industry speeches, donating anonymously to organizations that supported factory workers and their families. His cryptocurrency investments were redirected toward companies with authentic social missions. His pharmaceutical research focused increasingly on treatments accessible to working-class patients. One evening in late autumn, nearly a year after Daniel's return, The two men found themselves sharing coffee in Daniel's small apartment in Washington Heights. Drake had initially resisted the invitation, uncomfortable with the neighborhood's authentic poverty, but Daniel had insisted that true friendship required seeing each other's real worlds. Sitting beneath Maria's photograph, surrounded by the honest simplicity of Daniel's life, Drake seemed more relaxed than Daniel had ever seen him. They talked about baseball, about the changing seasons, about the small satisfactions of work done well. For a few hours, the pharmaceutical billionaire was simply Derek from Detroit, sharing stories with a friend who knew his real name and cared more about his character than his bank account. "I never thanked you properly," Drake said as the evening wound down. "Not for solving the theft, but for refusing to help me lie. You saved me from making a mistake that would have destroyed everything I was trying to build." Daniel smiled, understanding that Drake was referring to more than business success. A man who knows where he comes from can go anywhere with dignity. A man who denies his past will always be running from something. "My father's hands were stained too," Drake said quietly. "Not from sugarcane, but from factory oil and metal shavings. I used to be embarrassed by those stains when he picked me up from school. Now I wish I had hands that showed evidence of honest work." As Drake prepared to leave, riding the subway back to Manhattan in a gesture that would have been unthinkable months earlier, Daniel reflected on the unexpected journey they'd both traveled. Drake had learned that authenticity was more valuable than any pharmaceutical patent, while Daniel had discovered that dignity could survive exile and emerge stronger than before. Their friendship had become a testament to the possibility of genuine transformation, proof that even relationships built on inequality could evolve into something approaching authentic human connection. In a building full of people who'd traded pieces of their souls for cryptocurrency gains and pharmaceutical profits, two men had found a way to remain whole while helping each other remember who they'd always been beneath their masks of wealth and service. The seasons turned, and 845 Park Avenue continued to gleam with marble and gold, but its halls now echoed with something that had been missing for too long: the quiet satisfaction of work done with dignity, relationships built on respect, and the understanding that the most valuable inheritance was the one that couldn't be measured in dollars but had to be lived every single day. 3 years passed like chapters in a story that neither man could have predicted when their paths first collided in anger and misunderstanding. The pharmaceutical industry had taken notice of Drake's transformation, his authentic approach to business dealings, his commitment to accessible cancer treatments, his willingness to acknowledge his working-class roots in an industry built on aristocratic pretensions. Daniel, meanwhile, had become something unique in Manhattan's service industry, a building operations director who commanded respect not through fear or hierarchy, but through competence earned over nearly 2 decades of quiet excellence. His reputation extended far beyond 845 Park Avenue. Property management companies throughout the city sought his consultation on everything from staff retention to security protocols. But on a crisp December morning, as Christmas decorations began appearing in shop windows and the scent of roasting chestnuts filled the subway stations, both men faced reminders that time remained the one force that neither pharmaceutical wealth nor personal dignity could ultimately defeat. Daniel noticed the tremor in his left hand first, a subtle shakiness that appeared when he was tired or stressed. At 65, he attributed it to age and the accumulated wear of decades spent polishing marble and maintaining mechanical systems. But when the tremor persisted and began affecting his handwriting, Maria's voice in his memory urged him to seek medical attention. The diagnosis came on a January afternoon that felt as cold and final as winter itself. Parkinson's disease, early stage but unmistakably present, a neurological erosion that would progressively steal his coordination, his independence, his ability to perform the detailed work that had defined his adult life. Daniel sat in the neurologist's office, listening to explanations about dopamine and motor function, about treatments that could slow the progression but couldn't stop it entirely. The doctor was kind but clinical, discussing pharmaceutical interventions with the detached professionalism of someone who'd delivered similar news countless times. The good news, the neurologist explained, is that early detection gives us options. With proper medication and physical therapy, many patients maintain quality of life for years, sometimes decades. Daniel nodded, processing information that felt both abstract and terrifically concrete. He thought about his father, Ramon Rodriguez, who died suddenly of a heart attack at 67, his body simply stopping like a machine that had run too long without proper maintenance. There was something to be said for quick endings, Daniel realized, compared to the slow erosion that Parkinson's promised. The conversation he needed to have with Drake felt inevitable, but difficult. They'd built a friendship based on mutual respect and authentic connection, but Daniel's diagnosis would change their relationship's fundamental dynamics. He would need accommodations, medical leave, eventually a successor who could maintain the building's operations with the same attention to detail. Daniel chose to have the conversation in Drake's office, the same space where their original collision had occurred years earlier. But this time, the atmosphere was entirely different. Two men who'd learned to trust each other facing a challenge that neither pharmaceutical research nor personal dignity could easily overcome. "I have Parkinson's disease," Daniel said without preamble, believing that difficult truths were best delivered quickly. Drake's reaction was immediately, genuinely emotional in a way that would have been impossible during their first encounters. His expression showed not pity, but sorrow, the kind of grief shared between friends when life delivers undeserved hardships. "What can I do?" Drake asked. And Daniel heard in those 4 words everything their friendship had become. Not what the pharmaceutical industry could provide, not what money could purchase, but what one human being could offer another in the face of inevitable loss. "Help me train my replacement. Help me leave this building in good condition for whoever comes next." Drake nodded, understanding that Daniel was asking for the dignity of controlling his own departure rather than being forced out by medical limitations. It was exactly what Daniel would request: practical, honest, focused on service rather than self-pity. Over the following months, they worked together to document 15 years of institutional knowledge, creating manuals and protocols that could preserve Daniel's expertise even after his hands could no longer perform the physical work. Drake arranged for the best neurological care available, connecting Daniel with pharmaceutical research programs that offered cutting-edge treatments often unavailable to working-class patients. But more importantly, Drake gave Daniel something that couldn't be prescribed or purchased: the assurance that his contributions would be remembered, that his legacy at 845 Park Avenue would extend far beyond his employment period. The farewell party was held in the building's marble lobby on a spring evening, when the last light of day slanted through the tall windows like golden prayers. The event brought together residents who rarely acknowledged service staff, employees from every department, and even building workers from other properties who'd heard Daniel's reputation throughout Manhattan's service industry. Drake's speech was brief but heartfelt, acknowledging Daniel not as an employee who'd reached retirement, but as a man who'd taught him essential lessons about dignity, authenticity, and the true meaning of wealth. He announced the establishment of the Ramon Rodriguez Memorial Scholarship Fund, named for Daniel's father and designed to provide educational opportunities for working-class families seeking opportunities in building management and facility operations. Daniel's own remarks were characteristically modest, focusing on gratitude for the opportunity to serve, appreciation for colleagues who'd become friends, and hope that 845 Park Avenue would continue to be a place where dignity was respected regardless of job title or salary level. But the most meaningful moment came after the formal presentations. When Daniel and Drake found themselves alone in the lobby, they'd both come to understand as sacred space, the place where their unlikely friendship had been forged through collision, tested through separation, and strengthened through mutual recognition of each other's authentic selves. "I never thanked you for teaching me about my father," Drake said, his voice carrying the weight of 3 years' worth of transformation. Your father didn't need my recognition, Daniel replied. He needed yours. They stood in comfortable silence, surrounded by marble and gold that had witnessed their entire relationship, from its beginning in mutual misunderstanding to its conclusion in genuine friendship. Both men understood that Daniel's diagnosis marked the end of an era, but also the beginning of a legacy that would outlive both their individual contributions to 845 Park Avenue. Daniel's replacement was a young woman named Carmen Vega, a Puerto Rican immigrant whose attention to detail and quiet dignity reminded everyone of Daniel during his early years at the building. Daniel spent his final weeks training her personally, sharing not just technical knowledge, but the harder wisdom of how to maintain self-respect while serving people who might never acknowledge your humanity. Remember, he told her during their last working session together, dignity is something you carry inside yourself. They can fire you, they can ignore you, they can treat you like you're invisible. But they cannot take away who you are unless you let them. Carmen nodded. Understanding that she was receiving more than job training, she was inheriting a philosophy of service that honored both the work and the worker. On Daniel's final day, he walked through 845 Park Avenue one last time, his keys, that heavy ring of brass and steel that had been his constant companion for 18 years, now Carmen's responsibility. The building looked exactly the same, but Daniel's relationship to it had been completely transformed by time and circumstance. He was no longer the invisible janitor who'd absorbed secrets and endured condescension. He'd become something unprecedented in Manhattan's service industry, a working-class man who'd gained genuine respect from wealth, who'd taught a billionaire pharmaceutical magnate about the value of authenticity, who'd left behind a legacy measured not in financial terms but in human dignity preserved and passed forward. As Daniel walked out of 845 Park Avenue for the final time, he carried with him something more valuable than any retirement package. The knowledge that he'd remained true to himself throughout everything, that his father's lessons about dignity had proven stronger than any force that tried to diminish them, that authenticity was indeed the only inheritance that really mattered. The subway ride home to Washington Heights felt different now, not like exile, but like graduation. Daniel had work still to do, managing his medical condition, mentoring other service workers, living with dignity in whatever time remained to him. But he'd accomplished something that no pharmaceutical research could replicate and no cryptocurrency investment could purchase. He'd shown that a man's worth wasn't determined by his bank account, but by his character, that true wealth was measured in relationships built on mutual respect, that dignity was a choice that had to be made fresh every day regardless of circumstances. In a city that worshipped money and dismissed the working class, Daniel Rodriguez had proven that sometimes the most powerful person in the building wasn't the one who owned the penthouse, but the one who knew how to keep his word. 5 years later, on a warm October evening when the leaves in Central Park had turned the color of old gold, Daniel Rodriguez sat in his small apartment in Washington Heights, surrounded by mementos of a life lived with quiet integrity. The Parkinson's disease had progressed as the neurologists had predicted, stealing some of his coordination and independence, but it hadn't touched the essential core of who he was. His phone rang with regular frequency these days. Carmen Vega calling for advice about building operations, Drake checking on his health and sharing updates about pharmaceutical research, former colleagues seeking guidance about workplace dignity and professional respect. Daniel had become something he'd never expected to be, a mentor whose wisdom extended far beyond building maintenance into the deeper questions of how to live authentically in a world that often demanded compromise. The Ramon Rodriguez Memorial Scholarship Fund had grown into something significant, providing educational opportunities for dozens of working-class students pursuing careers in facilities management, building operations, and related service industries. Each year, Daniel interviewed scholarship candidates personally, looking not for academic excellence, but for the quiet dignity that suggested these young people understood the honor of service work properly performed. Drake's transformation had continued over the years. His pharmaceutical empire, now known for ethical business practices and accessible medication pricing. His wealth had grown substantially. Cryptocurrency investments alone had added billions to his net worth. But he'd also become known for his authenticity, his willingness to speak publicly about his working-class origins and the factory worker father who'd shaped his values. More importantly, their friendship had evolved into something that transcended their original roles as employer and employee. They met regularly, not in Drake's penthouse office, but in Daniel's apartment, sharing meals and conversations that ranged from baseball scores to philosophical reflections on aging, dignity, and the meaning of success. This evening was special, marking the 5th anniversary of Daniel's retirement and the 10th anniversary of their unlikely friendship. Drake had brought dinner from the Puerto Rican restaurant on Broadway, the same place Daniel had frequented during his years of service when money was tight, but pride demanded occasional small luxuries. They ate slowly, talking about everything and nothing, the building's current operations under Carmen's careful management, Drake's latest pharmaceutical innovations, the changing neighborhood that surrounded Daniel's apartment. Drake looked older now, his hair completely silver, his face carrying lines earned through years of authentic living rather than the artificial preservation that wealth typically purchased. "I've been thinking about legacy," Drake said as they finished their meal, "about what we leave behind when we're gone." Daniel nodded, understanding the reflection that came naturally to men their age. "Maria used to say that legacy wasn't what people remembered about you. It was what they became because they knew you. Carmen is your legacy at the building. She carries herself the same way you did, with that quiet dignity that makes residents treat her with respect they didn't know they possessed. And you've become something I never expected when we first met," Daniel replied with gentle honesty. "A wealthy man who remembers where he came from, who uses his pharmaceutical success to help people rather than just profit from them." Drake smiled, recognizing the compliment for what it was, acknowledgement that he'd learned to honor his father's memory through his actions rather than hide from it through financial accumulation. They sat in comfortable silence, two men who'd taught each other essential lessons about authenticity, dignity, and the true meaning of wealth. Outside the apartment windows, Washington Heights hummed with its usual evening rhythms, children playing in the streets, grandmothers calling them in for dinner, the distant sound of Spanish conversations mixing with traffic noise and urban life. "I want to ask you something," Drake said finally, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone approaching a significant request. "The Pharmaceutical Foundation is expanding its community outreach programs. We need someone to oversee the initiatives, not the financial aspects, but the human side, making sure we're actually helping people rather than just distributing money to look good." Daniel understood immediately what Drake was offering, a chance to continue meaningful work despite his medical limitations, an opportunity to use his accumulated wisdom about human dignity in service of broader social goals. It would be part-time, flexible schedule, working from home when your health requires it, Drake continued. "But I think you understand better than anyone what it means to maintain dignity in difficult circumstances, and that perspective would be invaluable for programs designed to help working-class families." The offer was generous, practical, and perfectly suited to Daniel's skills and limitations. But more than that, it represented the final evolution of their relationship, from employer and employee, to friends to collaborators in work that honored both men's deepest values. "I'd be honored to accept," Daniel said simply. As Drake prepared to leave that evening, walking to the subway station as he'd learned to do years earlier, both men understood that they'd completed a journey neither could have predicted when they first collided in anger and misunderstanding. Daniel had proven that dignity was powerful enough to survive exile, discrimination, and physical illness. That authenticity was indeed the most valuable inheritance a man could possess. Drake had learned to honor his origins rather than hide from them, to use his pharmaceutical wealth in service of the values his factory worker father had taught him. Their friendship had become a testament to the possibility of genuine transformation, proof that even relationships built on inequality could evolve into something approaching authentic human connection. In a city that worshipped money and dismissed the working class, two men had discovered that the most valuable wealth was measured in relationships built on mutual respect, shared truth, and the recognition that dignity belonged to everyone regardless of their bank account balance. As the seasons continued to turn and the years accumulated their weight of memory and loss, Daniel Rodriguez and Drake Harrison had created something unprecedented in Manhattan's hierarchical service industry, a legacy measured not in cryptocurrency gains or pharmaceutical profits, but in human dignity preserved, passed forward, and multiplied through every life they'd touched with their unlikely example of authentic friendship. The marble halls of 845 Park Avenue continued to gleam, watched over now by Carmen Vega's careful attention to detail and dignified presence. The building's residents, many of them pharmaceutical executives and cryptocurrency investors themselves, had learned to treat their service staff with a respect that seemed to emanate from the very walls where Daniel Rodriguez had once worked in humble invisibility. And in the evenings, when the city lights twinkled like scattered diamonds across Manhattan's endless ambition, Daniel would sit in his small apartment beneath Maria's photograph, his trembling hands steady enough to write letters to scholarship recipients, his voice still strong enough to counsel young workers about the honor of service, his dignity intact despite everything time and illness had tried to steal from him. He'd kept his word, just as his father Ramon Rodriguez had taught him. In a world full of broken promises and abandoned principles, Daniel had remained faithful to the simple truth that authenticity was the only inheritance that really mattered. And in teaching that lesson to a pharmaceutical billionaire who'd forgotten where he came from, Daniel had discovered that sometimes the most profound power belonged to those who appeared to have none at all. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose dignity over compromise, new chances to prove that wealth was measured not in financial portfolios, but in the courage to remain true to yourself when everyone around you had forgotten who they used to be. And Daniel Rodriguez, the janitor who'd become a teacher, would meet those challenges with the same quiet strength that had carried him through 15 years of invisible service and 5 years of visible respect. The story would continue, as all true stories do, in the lives of people who'd learned to see themselves more clearly because they'd encountered someone who understood that dignity was not a luxury reserved for the wealthy, but a birthright that belonged to everyone brave enough to claim it and strong enough to defend it against every force that tried to take it away. And you, have you ever felt invisible while holding everything together? Have you walked through marble halls where your presence was taken for granted, your wisdom overlooked, your dignity tested by people who confused wealth with worth? Tell me your story in the comments below, because every person who chooses authenticity over convenience is fighting the same battle Daniel fought, proving the same truth he proved. That character is the only currency that never loses its value. If this story touched something inside you, if it reminded you of your own struggles to maintain dignity in an undignified world, leave a like and subscribe so it reaches others who need to hear this message. Share it with someone who's forgotten their own worth, someone who's been made to feel invisible despite their essential contributions to everything around them. For more stories that honor the quiet heroes among us, the unsung guardians of dignity who keep the world functioning while others claim the credit, tap the podcast link on the left. These are the stories that matter, not because they're about the wealthy or the famous, but because they are about the rest of us, the ones who know that real strength is measured in integrity, real wealth in the respect we show each other, real success in the authenticity we maintain, regardless of how much money we'll never have. Thank you for walking this journey with Daniel and Drake, for understanding that sometimes the most important lessons are taught by those society considers least important, that sometimes the most valuable wisdom comes from people whose hands show the stains of honest work. We'll see you in the next story, where dignity will once again prove that it's the most powerful force in the world. not because it's loud or dramatic, but because it's quietly, persistently, eternally true.